Columbus and the First Americans. A real look at history. 90% of Native Americans vanished. Not in battle, but in their own homes. Wiped out by diseases they had never encountered. Columbus's arrival wasn't just an exploration. It marked the beginning of an extinction. They were dead before they even knew what was killing them. Was this inevitable, or was it by design? History holds the answers. Follow Native legends and history stories to uncover the truth they never taught you in school. To understand this, we must go beyond the well-worn narratives of European brutality. Because while the conquest of the Americas was undeniably violent, the lands Columbus and his men stepped onto were not untouched paradises of peace. They were territories carved out through centuries of war, shifting alliances, and brutal survival. The Great Plains, long before the arrival of European settlers, had already seen generations of bloodshed. In the dense forests of the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most formidable indigenous alliances, waged relentless war against their long-standing rivals. The Huron in these wars weren't mere skirmishes. They were fought with the intent of complete domination. Warriors set fire to enemy villages, taking captives for brutal torture rituals. One French Jesuit missionary, captured and later released, described how prisoners were subjected to fires so hot that their flesh peeled from their bones before they were granted the mercy of death. Entire families were either slaughtered or assimilated into the Iroquois ranks, children raised as warriors, women taken as wives, while the elderly and weak were discarded to the west. The Lakota Sioux were not always the dominant force of the Great Plains. They had come from the forests of Minnesota and fought fiercely to claim their new land, driving out the Omaha and Pawnee in a brutal struggle for control of the buffalo herds. The Pawnee pushed back but not broken, fought desperately to reclaim their territory. In one raid recorded by American explorers in the early 19th century, a Lakota war party ambushed a pony hunting camp at dawn, setting their teepee ablaze and cutting down anyone who tried to flee. The survivors, mainly women and children, were taken as captives or slaughtered outright. But perhaps no tribe embodied the warrior spirit more than the Comanche masters of horseback warfare. They dominated the southern plains with ruthless efficiency. The Spanish, the Apache, even European settlers, no one was spared from their raids. They swept into enemy camps at full gallop, their arrows striking before their victims could react. The Comanche did not believe in simply defeating an enemy. They annihilated them. A raid on a Pueblo settlement in the mid-1700s left no survivors. Men were burned alive. Women were taken as slaves, and children were either adopted or executed. A Comanche warrior's reputation was built on his ability to kill, and torture was not just punishment. It was a spectacle, a show of dominance. Yet this wasn't unique to the Great Plains. In the arid lands of the Southwest, the Apache and Navajo fought wars that spanned generations, their conflicts leaving scars across the desert. In Mesoamerica, the mighty Aztecs waged the infamous Flower Wars, ritual battles fought for the sole purpose of taking prisoners for sacrifice. Thousands were marched up the towering steps of Tenochtitlan's temples, where their hearts were cut out as offerings to the gods. Spanish chroniclers recorded the rivers of blood that flowed down the temple steps, describing the air thick with the scent of death. Even isolated communities were not safe from war. The evidence at Crow Creek, South Dakota, paints a grim picture of intertribal violence. Around 1325, an entire village was massacred. 486 Bada's men, women and children left in a shallow mass grave. Their skulls were crushed, their bones showed signs of scalping and blunt force trauma, their bodies discarded as carrion for scavengers. No one knows for sure who the attackers were, but one thing is clear: this was not an isolated event. It was a reality of life long before European contact. For those who lived in these lands before Columbus, violence was not an invasion. It was an expectation. Yet history often paints a different picture. The noble warrior, the peaceful native, the harmonious relationship with nature. These are the images popular culture clings to. But survival was brutal and war was constant. Some tribes like the Hopi and Zuni built societies around agriculture, developing intricate systems of irrigation and pottery, creating works of art that still endure today. But others like the Comanche lived by the horse and the bow. They left no great monuments, numbered temples, no elaborate carvings, only the memory of raids, of blood spilled on the prairie, of power won through war. And so the question remains, when Columbus arrived, did he bring violence to a peaceful world? Or did he step into one already shaped by it? The world Columbus encountered was one already shaped by conflict. But the arrival of Europeans introduced something far deadlier than tribal warfare, a system of conquest that combined military force, religious justification, and economic exploitation on a scale the Americas had never seen before. Within just a few decades, the Taino population of Hispaniola fell from an estimated 150 to fewer than a few thousand. It was a calculated campaign, written into law and carried out with ruthless efficiency. In 1493, just a year after Columbus first set foot in the Caribbean, Pope Alexander VI issued the Inter Se Terra, a decree that granted Spain dominion over any lands not ruled by Christians. The justification was clear. These lands were to be claimed for the expansion of the Catholic faith. In reality, this decree gave Spain the legal and moral cover to seize land, enslave its inhabitants, and strip the New World of its wealth. For the Spanish crown, the Americas were not a distant curiosity, they were a financial opportunity. The monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella had invested heavily in Columbus's voyages, and they expected a return. Gold, silver, spices, whatever could be taken would be taken. To achieve this, the Spanish established the encomienda system, a brutal form of forced labor that placed entire indigenous communities under the control of Spanish settlers. In theory, encomenderos were supposed to protect the indigenous people and convert them to Christianity. In practice, it was slavery in all but name. Those placed under encomienda were expected to work in mines, fields, and settlements for their Spanish overlords, often without pay, often under the threat of violence. If they resisted, they were tortured or killed. If they failed to meet their quotas, they were punished severely. The system was designed to extract as much wealth as possible from the land and from the bodies of its people. But perhaps the clearest example of Spanish brutality came not from royal decrees but from Columbus himself. When Columbus was appointed governor of Hispaniola, the largest island in the Caribbean, he ruled with an iron fist. To him, the indigenous Taino people were not equals, nor were they partners in exploration. They were subjects to be controlled, laborers to be exploited. He imposed a harsh gold tribute system. Every Taino over the age of 14 was required to deliver a quota of gold to the Spanish. Those who failed had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death as a warning to others. Since gold was scarce in many regions, fulfilling these quotas was impossible. Thousands died from exhaustion, disease, or execution for failing to meet an unachievable demand. Columbus's men treated the island as their personal kingdom of terror. Women were taken as concubines, with many accounts detailing how Spanish soldiers kidnapped young Taino girls as young as 9 or 10, selling them into sexual slavery. One of Columbus's own companions, Machil de Cuneo, wrote with disturbing enthusiasm about being given a Taino girl and how he brutally raped her. For the men, the punishment was just as cruel. When a group of Taino resisted Spanish control, Columbus ordered a mass execution. Some were burned alive in public. Others had their bodies mutilated and displayed as warnings. Those who survived fled into the mountains, only to be hunted down like animals. The horrors on Hispaniola were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger strategy of conquest, one that spread across the Americas as Spanish explorers pushed further inland. Few accounts capture the full brutality of Spanish rule. Better than the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who initially supported the conquest, but later became one of its fiercest critics. He witnessed firsthand the treatment of the native people and recorded it in shocking detail. They took infants from their mothers, swinging them by their feet and smashing their heads against rocks. Others were thrown into rivers, their bodies floating down the current as Spanish soldiers laughed. Las Casas describe how entire villages were wiped out for sport on some occasions. Spanish soldiers would tie groups of indigenous men together, hanging them from wooden poles in groups of 13, one for each apostle as they mockingly claimed, and then set them on fire. One particularly gruesome method of execution involved testing the sharpness of Spanish swords. Las Casas recorded that Spanish soldiers would bet on who could cut a man in half with a single swing of their blade. To them it was a game. To the indigenous people, it was the end of everything they had ever known. The obsession with gold drove Spanish cruelty to unimaginable extremes. When gold deposits were exhausted in some regions, Columbus and his successors turned to another commodity. Human lives in 1495. Columbus organized a slave raid, capturing over 500 Taino men and women, crammed onto ships like cargo. Hundreds died before they even reached Spain. Those who survived were sold in European markets, paraded through Spanish streets like exotic animals. On the island itself, the remaining Taino were forced into back-breaking labor. Without food, without rest, without mercy, they died in staggering numbers. Some chose suicide over submission. Mothers were seen drowning their own children to spare them from a life of torture. Others starved themselves, refusing to eat until their bodies wasted away. Within just a few decades, the Taino population of Hispaniola fell from an estimated 250 to fewer than a few thousand. The same pattern repeated itself across the Caribbean. Entire cultures were wiped out in less than a century. As brutal as Spanish rule was, the deadliest force they brought was something unseen. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread through the native population like wildfire. Having never been exposed to these diseases before, indigenous immune systems stood no chance. By the time the Spanish arrived in Mexico, smallpox had already begun ravaging the Aztec Empire. A single infected slave, carried into the capital city of Tenochtitlan, triggered an outbreak that killed hundreds of thousands. In a matter of months, bodies piled up in the streets. Entire villages were left abandoned. Priests could not keep up with the number of dead, and soon even the survivors gave up on burying their loved ones. By 1521, when the Spanish finally overthrew the Aztecs, the population of Mexico had dropped from 25 million to just 3 million. Disease did what swords could not. It crushed an empire before it could even fight back. By the end of the 16th century, the indigenous civilizations of the Caribbean were all but extinct. The once thriving populations of Central and South America had been reduced to a fraction of their former size. Spanish rule brought wealth to Europe, but at a cost measured in blood. Was this genocide? Was it intentional? Or simply the tragic outcome of conquest? One thing is certain: the world Columbus opened was not one of discovery, but of destruction. The scars of that violence still linger, written into the land, into the history, and into the stories of those who survived. History is filled with conquest. Long before Columbus, armies swept across continents, toppling civilizations and redrawing maps in blood. The Mongols razed entire cities, leaving only smoldering ruins where great empires once stood. The Romans crushed their enemies, enslaved their people, and imposed their rule with an iron fist. The Normans stormed England, wiping out the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy in a brutal campaign of dominance. The Aztecs, long before the Spanish arrived, built their empire through war, demanding tribute and sacrifices from the peoples. They subjugated tens of thousands of captives, climbed the temple steps of Tenochtitlan, only to have their hearts cut out as offerings to the gods in the Andes. The Inca expanded their vast domain by absorbing or annihilating their neighbors. Conquest was not unique to Columbus. He was not the first to take by force, nor the last. His arrival in the Americas did not introduce war. It stepped into a world already shaped by it. But what made European expansion different? Was its scale the combination of superior weaponry, relentless ambition, and devastating disease created a catastrophe unlike anything the world had seen before. Historians today debate Columbus not as a singular villain, but as a catalyst for an era of exploitation. He did not set out with the intent to exterminate entire civilizations, but his actions paved the way for an age where human lives became a currency for wealth and power. Carlos Martinez Shaw, a Spanish historian, acknowledges this complexity. Columbus was not the architect of genocide, but the consequences of his voyages led to mass destruction. Others, like historian Steve Hackle, argue blaming Columbus for everything is too simple. But ignoring the role he played in centuries of oppression is equally dishonest. The reality is that Columbus was neither a hero nor a demon. He was a man of his time, driven by ambition, caught in a system that rewarded conquest. The world he helped create was built on suffering, but it was not a world he controlled alone. To condemn Columbus without acknowledging the violence that existed before him is to misunderstand history. To excuse his actions because war was always part of life is equally flawed. The past is neither a morality play nor a simple battle between good and evil. It is a collision of forces, some inevitable, some deliberate, all with lasting consequences. War and empire have shaped every civilization. The difference is in how we choose to remember them. History is complicated, it is uncomfortable. But if we only see it in absolutes, we will never understand it at all. Subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories for more untold truths about the past.